Everyone, I hope everybody can hear me. My name is Councillor Nesrin Çalışkan. I'm the chair of the Local Government Association's Safer and Stronger Communities Board and the leader of Enfield Council. Today we'll be discussing the best approaches to tackle antisocial behaviour in our communities. We'll also be reflecting on how councils and the police have been tackling antisocial behaviour during the COVID period and looking at lessons learnt that can be shared. We know that many residents and businesses, councils, the police, their partners are keen to protect residents from offenders who can make the lives of those they target a misery. Councillors, and I know too well, often hear of antisocial behaviour referred to as low-level crime. The problem, of course, with that terminology is that it can sound like we are dismissing the cumulative impact that antisocial behaviour can have on its victims and our communities. It can affect someone's day-to-day life, often when an individual is in their own home, and it can have a serious impact on a person's mental health and well-being. Whilst reports of criminal incidents have fallen during COVID-19, we have seen an increase in the number of reports for antisocial behaviour. Of course, there could be a number of reasons for this, and it's possible that breaches of social distancing measures could be partly responsible for the increase. And general tension in the air in our communities during what is, of course, a very difficult time. So today's session has been organised to discuss what more we can do to prevent antisocial behaviour, to reflect on how the current antisocial behaviour tools and powers are being used, particularly during COVID-19, and what more, if anything, could be done to improve our collective response. As you'll see from the agenda, we have excellent speakers lined up for today, and I'd like to welcome all of our speakers and thank them in advance for taking the time. We'll begin with our very first speaker, Dame Vera Beard, the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales. Dame Vera.
Good to unmute myself first. I hope I'm now sharing my slides and being visible. Is that correct? Good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is the view from the Victims Commissioner. And so let me tell you about the Victims Commissioner role in a couple of seconds. You can see at the bottom of this second slide that my job is to promote the role of victims and witnesses, encourage good practice in their treatment, and keep under review the operation of the Victims Code. The Victims Code is quite a criminal justice oriented code. So they're my core obligations. Next, you might think I would put up a slide with my powers on it as Victims Commissioner. And if I tried to do, it would be empty because I don't have any powers at all. So we operate trying to drive the agenda you see before you by making axes arrangements. We keep very closely linked to victims and their organisations because it isn't what Vera Baird thinks victims want, it is what they tell me they want. And we do get some access to ministers to be able to lobby. So sometimes we're able to bring about change. And one technique we use to try to do so is to do research reports about themes. And in 2019, my predecessor as Victims Commissioner did with these people a report about antisocial behaviour called Living a Nightmare. And it found out some key victims' experiences. And I think much of it is summed up, frankly, from the quote at the top. Importantly, when this report was made, there was a survey done and 38% of people in Britain said that they'd either witnessed closely or personally experienced antisocial behaviour. That was at the time the highest since the Office of National Statistics began recording this figure. This March, YouGov, just before lockdown, showed that 61% of people felt more was needed to be done to tackle antisocial behaviour in their own locale, and 39% saying it had got worse. What I wanted to emphasise was the point our hostess has just made, which is there is, and I emphasise that I don't mean Andy Profit, who's following, who is excellent and dynamic, but police generally can see antisocial behaviour as kind of sub-crime. So, if my shed's broken into and my spade is stolen, that will be a crime, but it's not really going to fundamentally undermine the way I live my life. But antisocial behaviour, when somebody is at home, say they have a hedge, behind it young people sit and drink their beer, chuck their cans into the garden, people kick a ball against the gable end regularly, they stamp on the plants, they chuck the leftover of their food into the garden, even at the window, and if you go out to complain, they shout abuse at you, then very, very soon this is seriously going to undermine you. It is not low level in terms of its impact on an individual. People feel targeted, and people quite often are targeted for their vulnerability, but it can radically change the way that they live their lives and stop them from feeling comfortable at home, even to the extent that quite often they have to move. Now, my predecessor's report found from a good range of research that victims felt pushed from pillar to post. No one agency to whom they had resort taking any real charge. There was a specific complaint about 101 as a police number, but let me come back to that later. It is possible that this kind of behaviour in an unruly area is a symptom of more serious crime, so it shouldn't be disregarded for that reason. But essentially, the cumulative effect of antisocial behaviour is important, and the risk is that the police do regard it as subcrime, record only an isolated incident that might be called a crime, and never therefore get the full picture. So we follow on from my predecessor's report with the item that she wanted to champion and I want to champion too, and I would be very keen to gain your support for. So there is a thing called a community trigger. I have to say this is, I think, the third time I've talked with LGA backing, and the first time, rather less than a year ago, although it was counsellors who were well apprised about antisocial behaviour, very, very few of them had ever heard of the community trigger. So it came about in the 2015 legislation, but it wasn't being used at all, really, by the time we wrote this report in 2019, and it still is very, very scantily being used. It is intended to empower the citizen who's being disempowered by becoming a victim of antisocial behaviour. If their situation passes the threshold, which is 3 qualifying complaints of antisocial behaviour causing harassment, alarm or distress, which is the upper definition of the 2 in statute, then they can require an ASB case review, and all of the relevant bodies must meet together and they must tackle this problem. And the relevant bodies are like certainly the police, certainly local authority, almost certainly housing, and possibly health input too. The idea is that you have been pushed from pillar to post, or you haven't got satisfaction through your 3 complaints to any of the relevant bodies, and now you can require them all to come together and tackle it in a unified way. So that's how it should work, but it hasn't really worked. Argument that its use, not its nature, is not fit for purpose. So over the period when the review was being done by my predecessor, over the period since the report was produced and I've taken it forward, it is clear that what continues is a lack of knowledge and understanding about the community trigger at all by police, by local authorities, by housing. Local authorities, PCCs, are supposed to advertise the community trigger and inform victims when they're coming to the threshold of the community trigger. But only 3% of people had ever heard of the community trigger. That's somewhat out of date now, but there is nothing in the data to suggest that it has changed. So there is no real transparency about how you go about getting a community trigger. The threshold which I set out clearly, nonetheless, can be varied local authority to local authority. So that itself is about when it can be activated, and many people in Northumberland, which is a county where I used to function, they found that every application for the community trigger, and there weren't many, were below the threshold. Well, that is pretty unlikely to be the case. And so there isn't, I think, the right clarity about it. Look at the bottom spot on that slide. Victims should be at the resolution meetings, and although some guidance says the Home Office have set up said that they should be too, they are not, as a rule, invited. When I talk about as a rule, I really have to say that the application of the community trigger has been so slight that in many local authorities, the number of applications for it are in single figures, and at the last count, in over 1/3 of local authorities, there's never been one at all. But certainly victims should be there. Otherwise, you are in danger, as the second bottom spot here says, of just the public having the view that the local authority gets together with the other two to say, look, how can we deal with this nuisance? And is not, nobody is reviewing what's happened before. We have ascertained that a councillor can apply for a community trigger on behalf of their constituent. An MP can do so, and we really advocate that independent representation be made available so that victims not only go, but they are represented there, probably by their MP or somebody from the local authority, or if they can be brought into victims funding, which victims of antisocial behaviour are not at the moment, let me emphasise, but that was another recommendation of my predecessor's report, then people like victim support, who are ideal, could drive this agenda to use the community trigger and could represent people there. And our suggestion too was that the ward councillor should be the person who chairs this community trigger event, so that the interests of the ward, which is being affected by antisocial behaviour, is at the forefront of the meeting. So the nutshell there is that it's not working, it's not being taken up, and it's pretty important that it should be. Here is Elizabeth's story. She had a 4-year campaign. There were by a neighbour, 5 warnings served on that neighbour, tried to activate the trigger, was told she didn't meet the standard, which is completely inconsistent with 5 warnings of that calibre. She eventually got a community trigger, but wasn't allowed to be present at the resolution hearing, and it made insufficient difference for her ultimately having to take her family away to get away from this individual. And when we did the report, I hope it's not still the case, the perpetrator had followed them and continued to harass her at her workplace. So an attempt which didn't succeed. I really want to urge everybody to do what they can to make the community trigger effective. I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but prior to the 2015 legislation, there were 3 years of research amongst academics around the victims area, all concluding that this was a good tool to establish and to use, and it's never been properly used at all. And so let's see if we can take it forward, give it a good try for a couple of years, and if it doesn't prove to be effective, well then we will have to think again. So 16 months after the report done by my predecessor, which was called, not surprisingly, Living a Nightmare, the one thing that's changed is that she got the 101 number made free of charge. 38% of people at the time of the report were suffering from antisocial behaviour or witnessing it. These organisations' findings and data, including our own, show significant increases. The police reported in April, after lockdown, a 59% increase across the country in antisocial behaviour. What's not so straightforward about that is that breaches of COVID regulations come into that category of antisocial behaviour in some places, though I've been trying to say there should be separate reporting. It doesn't seem to have taken off, but Andy will know better. But what I think is very important is that I have a regular meeting with victims hubs in the PCC areas every 2 weeks. And they show a significant increase of antisocial behaviour victims seeking help. So I suggest that suggests it's not COVID-related stuff, which you might report, but is not that likely to be impinging on your own way of life, so that you seek help from a victims hub. So I suggest, and I suspect, that it has gone up, real antisocial behaviour and not just the COVID staff. Victim support, who run 20 of the victims hubs run by PCCs, have shown month on month increases, and it's now 54% over their baseline, and 161% hits on their website have increased by 161%. In Northumbria, you can see a victims hub usually gets double figures, now is getting 4 or 5 times that number of antisocial behaviour hits. Avon and Somerset smaller, but more than doubled, and London itself up by 40%. So I think all the evidence is that it is getting worse, and still we're not doing too much about it. So very quickly, we decided to write with some antisocial behaviour charities to the Home Secretary, asking her to implement Living a Nightmare's full recommendations, which go beyond the community trigger, but one of them was that. We asked for units to be centrally funded to allow community safety partnerships to quantify and tackle the quantity of antisocial behaviour that there was. We call them Nightingale task forces because everything that's special to COVID is, of course, not called Nightingale. If it's a court, it's a hospital, so why not a Nightingale task force? And we thought that there should be access to those task and finish task forces to include legal advice, so that we could use every one of the statutory measures as well as the community trigger. And we felt that the presence, just from the nature of some of the complaints that are coming to the victims hubs, the presence of mental health services was a very important component in tackling this. So we wrote and said so. We got a reply saying, actually, up to March last year, antisocial behaviour was falling. Well, we were writing, to be honest, about since March of last year. The Home Secretary also says they held regular meetings with Andy, and I'm sure they do, and I expect he'll tell you about it, but not a lot of progress appears nonetheless to be being made. I too, with Andy, am on a cross-departmental committee to tackle antisocial behaviour led by the Home Office, which doesn't seem to be what my mother would call cutting the mustard. She said that most of the antisocial behaviour that's gone up looks like breaches of social distancing measures being reported. But as I say, that is a quite unlikely thing to drive somebody to go into the arms of victim support or the victims hubs in Avon, Somerset, London, or in Northumbria. So I think it is different. The reply also said the community trigger allows you to trigger this formal review. Well, yes, it does. And bodies are required to publish information. Well, yes, they are. but not a lot of it is happening, as I've already said. She acknowledged the need to raise awareness of the community trigger, and jolly good. She has refreshed the antisocial behaviour pages on Gov.uk to make information on the community trigger more accessible. So there is a little bit of progress. So antisocial behaviour, as our host and I have both said, is serious stuff. It does lead people very often to have to leave homes that they don't want to leave. It does even drive people to self-medicate to get away from it, to self-harm sometimes to get away from it. It's distinctly not some crime. There are a lot of recommendations in this report which haven't been actioned, which need actioning. We want to champion the community trigger and give it a good go, a good attempt to see if it can re-empower disempowered victims of antisocial behaviour. So I should be very glad to join in any thoughts and questions we have. This is Poppy, the most cerebral member of the Baird family, and she is my final slide, indicating that I look forward to the question time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dame Vera. I will invite our second speaker, Assistant Chief Constable Andy Prophet, Essex Police and National Policing Lead for Tackling Antisocial Behaviour. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair, and hopefully my comms are coming through okay. If I can just check at the start. Perfect, thank you. And I think one of the amazing team at the centre will be flying my slides for me, which is superb. There they go backwards. So yes, good afternoon, everybody. Really good to chat to you all this afternoon. My name is Andy Prophet, as the slide says. I'm an Assistant Chief Constable with Essex Police, but I'm also the National Police Chiefs Council Lead for ASB. Kind of why is that important? I've been an officer for 25 years, not all of which clearly as an Assistant Chief Constable. My first 6 years were spent as a community officer in a really challenged neighbourhood in Essex, and I saw every single day the links between crime and antisocial behaviour and how that can ruin communities and devastate lives. So that is just fundamentally, and you know that, and I know that, this is massively important stuff. It affects people's lives and can lead to loss of life. Let's not beat around the bush. Antisocial behaviour can be devastating. And so as we move on to the next slide, can I just say thank you for what you do, and hopefully we'll continue to do in this space. It would seem odd, would it not, if the cop in the room virtually didn't talk about the law. So you can see what's written on the screen. Antisocial behaviour was defined back in 1988. The broad point I want to make here is this is a really wide definition, and I think deliberately so. The key points for me: causes or is likely to cause. So we have an obligation to act where things are starting to build, to get in there early and to solve problems. Harassment, alarm and distress, causing people's life to be less than comfortable when it's to one or more individuals outside the household. This is just such important stuff, folks. We have legislation that allows us and expects us to work together to make a difference to people's lives. Thank you. We'll carry on. Of course, it's more than just words as we move on onto the next slide. Antisocial behaviour is something that affects us all, from whether it be from graffiti, whether it be from youngsters hanging around on street corners, through to drug taking in communities, through to street drinking, homelessness, which is a real ongoing and current challenge, neighbourhood and street crime, but fundamentally victims of antisocial behaviour and crime. And we know, we can all remember that tragic case over a decade ago now of Fiona Pilkington, where antisocial behaviour, repeated antisocial behaviour, caused a tragic loss of life. This is more than words. This is more than words. Antisocial behaviour is more than about the law. It's about people feeling safe in their communities and in their home. And Dame Vera has quite rightly set the challenge that I will come on to and re-emphasise of we've got to do more together, but let's not mince our words. Of course, we have to be discerning. There's a lot of things for us to do, but everything I feel about, whether it be the community trigger, whether it be how we work in partnership, it's about getting that early intervention in place, taking a discerning approach to where we work together to help those individuals and communities most in need, and we can make a difference in this space. Thank you. We'll move on to the next slide if that's okay. So just reinforcing the point that was made, it's been a massively challenging nationally and globally last 6 months, and we're not through this, folks, are we? So this is the England and Wales antisocial behaviour data over about the last 12 months, and you can see that enormous increase in recorded antisocial behaviour from March into the early summer. Now that is because this includes antisocial behaviour directly linked to issues like social distancing, as Dame Vera pointed to. So that has undoubtedly increased the level of antisocial behaviour that we understand is happening. But as we move on to the next slide, and Dame Vera again made this point, when you break that down and when you start to take out those incidents that are clearly linked to the coronavirus, residual ASB, as is highlighted there in the final point, is up. The best latest analysis we've got is 10 to 12%. So we are having more victims, more communities being affected by antisocial behaviour, irrespective of the coronavirus challenge. And when you think about this, that makes sense, doesn't it? It's not okay, but it makes sense. Families at home, children and young people with less to do, frustration, boredom, tensions, uncertainty lead to antisocial behaviour being enacted, being seen, and all the consequences that can absolutely flow from there. I know these are cold, hard figures, and there's human stories behind this, but the data captures the story we think, or the stories we are being told by victims. There is an absolute correlation there. This is not just about coronavirus. There is an increase in ASB. Thank you. Let's move on to the next slide. This is, I couldn't find better words than this. This is Dame Vera's predecessor, Baroness Newlove, who, this is, I think, probably a familiar and a tragic story of how her life was devastated, and you can see the words there. I mean, actually, I'm going to read the words because I think the words are powerful. A gang targeted my ordinary working family living in an ordinary street in an ordinary neighbourhood with a campaign of vandalism and violence. It culminated with Gary, Baroness Luloff's husband, being kicked to death on our doorstep. And it seems implausible that 12 years later, this was at the time of the Living the Nightmare report, I'm still writing about antisocial behaviour, but the truth is, depressingly little has changed. ASB is often downplayed as petty, low-level crime. And it's clearly not, we know that. But put yourself in their shoes. To suffer from ASB is an ordeal that causes misery, disturbs sleep, anxiety, work and relationships, leaving victims feeling unsafe and afraid in their own homes. Leaving people feeling unsafe in their own homes, and it can feel like you're living a nightmare. Powerful words, and this is an awful case that thankfully is rare, but there are many thousands of people feeling anxious in their homes and not feeling safe, and that's why I'm determined, with you, with Dame Vera, with the Home Office, with anybody who can help, to make a difference in this space, because we must do. Thank you. We'll move on to the next slide. Dame Vera has covered much of this. There is a extremely authoritative piece of work, academic rigour from Nottingham Trent University, that really sets out what we need to take forward, whether that be influencing and encouraging central government around revisions to the Victims Code of Practice, so that a victim of antisocial behaviour has the same enshrined rights that a victim of crime does. Putting antisocial behaviour on the same footing as crime, because it's not no level, is work we are needing to do and are seeking to influence nationally. we've touched on 101 service. It's now a free service, but making sure that it's prompt and efficient and effective and supported by good opportunities for digital reporting and digital engagement around antisocial behaviour is another key work stream. And then really touching into community trigger, as Dame Vera has very, very clearly set out. The recommendation is in this report, there should be a legal requirement on key partners, local authorities, police and crime commissioners, forces, housing associations and others to prominently display, to really show to victims how they can say, I'm not happy with how this has been how this has been dealt with. Can I have a review? And can I be involved in that review? Now, there are some local authorities, there are some housing associations and some forces, PCCs, who are doing this really well. There are more who we've got work to do. And this is a key piece of work, I think, for us and for me to lead with you over the next 12 months, to put the community trigger and put action in place around these really important recommendations. It needs to be more than just a report. I'm absolutely certain it's right, and we need to make it actually start to land. Thank you. Let's move on to the next slide. So through my office and one of the fantastic voluntary organisations, Resolve ASB, we have funded in March and August 2 small, about a couple of thousand people each time, YouGov surveys. So this is some of the latest information that the public and victims are telling us about antisocial behaviour. And again, you can read them for yourself, but some of the headlines I wanted to draw out: over half of ASB isn't reported to anybody. So think back to that slide. There's a lot of it, and there's an awful lot more of it, but half of it isn't probably reported. So the problem is even more acute. About a third to 4 out of 10 people saying it's got worse or it continues to be a problem in their area. Then two really significant numbers here: 82% of victims saying more needs to be done, and 76% of those who witness ASB saying more needs to be done. And then the challenge to us all here, my organisations and your organisations, and I know this is tricky work, but we need to do better in this space more consistently. And the consistency piece is the real challenge here, because you can see that 59, 69 and 72% of victims saying that they're not satisfied with the responses at the moment that we're able to put together. So a clear focus for us. We will keep doing this survey every 6 months, so we keep getting a snapshot of how we're doing, what victims are saying, how communities are feeling, and there's some good measures here of, do we start to move this forward? Are we starting to get the connections and the experience of victims right? Thank you. We'll move on again if that's okay. Partnership is absolutely everything, and there's a really awfully familiar story that comes out when things don't go right, isn't there? Not just in antisocial behaviour, but in other spaces. How often do we hear that those signs, the information, the working together, the lessons haven't been learned? Whether that's from police, whether that's from local authorities, whether that's from health services, the third sector, academia, or community safety partnerships. We have to work together, and there are some superb examples of this, really superb examples of this that I'm massively passionate about, that I hear every single day. Some superb stories of where we get things right. We just need to really work hard to make that as consistent as we can. And that final graphic that popped up there, the police, the community safety partnerships, it's not police, it's the community safety partnerships of which police are part, I think are the absolute bedrock of local problem solving, where understanding local community needs and coming together and making a difference is how we will make a difference to the quality of lives of those affected by antisocial behaviour and crime. Thank you. We'll move on. Just a quick example to share with you where I think we're really starting to make a difference, and it's a model where we can absolutely pick it up and broaden it out. So around homelessness, a national operation that I'm seeking to advocate with partners. we've given it a name because it's what police officers do, isn't it? Operation Luscombe. But we've been talking to the Home Office and MHCLG about it. Actually, it's up to 23 different county areas now, and this is all about bringing police, health, drug and alcohol treatment workers, housing officers, probation officers together onto streets to talk to the local homeless community, not just ticket them, not just move them on, not just kind of clear the streets out the way, but understand who's on the streets, why they're on the streets, what help they need, what's preventing them being in a home. And there's all sorts of different issues behind it. And then making a positive offer to them through those frontline services to help them with whatever help they need. And then, if they don't take up that offer of help, and it's the right thing to do, think about moving to enforcement measures to require them to do that. So if we go on to the next slide, just a little bit of information about how that's happening. So this is an example close to, well, it's in my force area in Colchester in Essex, where we've done exactly as I've just said, that partnership enforcement team. We got a local disused shop in the high street where we operate from. So there's that regular offer of help to local communities and vulnerable individuals, and where they don't take the support that's on offer to them, we then use community protection warnings and community protection notices, ultimately which can move up to criminal justice use of criminal behaviour orders, if appropriate, to nudge them in the right direction. Remarkably, what it showed is that you can see the coloured boxes at the end. People needed very little encouragement when help was offered, and on very few occasions did we have to move to warning. So there's a different way of working in partnership to deal with what can be a massive driver of community uncertainty and fear, and indeed antisocial behaviour around aggressive begging, street drinking, and all the other complex matters that can surround homelessness. So local delivery, partnership and problem solving, for me, it is an absolute imperative to how we do our business together. Thank you. We'll move on to the next slide. And this is just to promote to you all, and hopefully you'll have access to the slides. I'm happy for them to be shared afterwards. A knowledge hub that we've set up with within the work that I've been leading over the last year or so. That's a publicly available knowledge hub. I've included the link on the slide there, but it's sharing best practice, it's sharing what's worked, what's not worked. There's forums in there to kind of share problems and see if there's anybody fixed this somewhere else before. It's not just open to police, it's open to any community safety partnerships and third sectors. It's not big enough yet. There's not enough people involved. I really want to enrich this conversation. Think about how it might link to other channels. There's some great YouTube videos out there I'm hearing about of practitioners talking about real success stories. So I want to build this knowledge hub of how we can work together, because you'll have some fantastic ideas that need to be shared, and equally you may have some problems that someone else has already worked their way through. So let's bring our expertise alive through the knowledge hub is my request to you there. And I think my final slide is only to draw together some key thoughts of what I think the next 12 months needs to look like. Well, we all need to do point one quite clearly. The very fact that you're here, I know, means that you don't need to be convinced of that, but we need to influence and encourage and keep helping others to do that. We've got tough months ahead. COVID is not going away, sadly, quickly, it would appear at the moment. So we will continue to have that escalated level of community concern and apprehension. But if we get our partnership structure right, and this is local in my view, not nationally delivered, there's bits that need to be influenced nationally in terms of framework and impetus and funding, but delivery is always local in my view. If we focus on the community trigger, and let me be clear on what I think about that, within 12 months, why can we not have every single local authority, police force, PFCC website with real, clear, succinct, up-to-date information around the community trigger, saying this is your right as a victim. I know we need to build infrastructure behind it to deal with that and what victims say, but it's got to be the right thing to do, I feel certain. But I need your support in taking that forward clearly. And next year, we plan to do this in April just gone, but obviously coronavirus put an end to it, we would like to have a national ASB awareness week where we can showcase and promote and advertise all this massively important work we've just talked about. So one on the radar for next year, if events allow. I'm working with others to have a really significant national profile raising ASB awareness week, and we will continue through that work to seek to influence government and others to get this absolutely right. But I'd like to finish where I started. I'm massively passionate about this. This is really important stuff, folks, and I'm incredibly grateful for you giving up some of your time, because without your support, we won't crack it together. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Andy. I will swiftly move on to Daryl Edmonds, Neighbourhood and Criminal Justice Strategic Manager from Richmond and Wandsworth Councils. Daryl.
Thank you very much, Chair. Hello everybody, my name is Daryl Edmonds. I've worked from a policing, housing and council background, and I've worked in London and outside of London, so quite a bit of experience around ASB. My current role as Neighbourhoods Criminal Justice means I manage the neighbourhoods from a council perspective and from the Community Safety Partnership perspective in Richmond and Wandsworth. I manage violent crime, and I also manage the criminal justice elements, which includes YOS and IOM for those. So basically, what I'm going to talk about very quickly, because I've got about 10 to 15 minutes, is I'm going to cover data, some notifiable issues that have occurred during COVID, some partnership work, some communication examples, and some of the tools that we've used. So very quickly on the data side of things, and I've noticed in some of the questions that people, data is only as it is. Currently, we rely very heavily on police data around ASB, but there are other elements such as housing and councils that do cover data, but I'm using mainly police data that's available to the public. In London, we have seen, in London this is, year to date, we've seen 127% increase in antisocial behaviour reports, or over the last 12 months, you can put that down as 53.6% increase in London. And in one of my boroughs in Wandsworth, it's actually been more than that in London, which is interesting. And I'm very much aware that the police have been recording COVID breaches within the ASB data, which causes a bit of a concern. And at our last Safer Neighbourhood Board scrutiny meeting, that was called into question. And the reason that was called into question is on the ground, from councillors, from ASB officers, from professionals across the network, there is a real understanding there's been a real increase in ASB as opposed to just COVID reporting. 81% of the reporting I've mentioned to the police is reported using the PEN part, which is the personal, nuisance and environmental definition. 81% of it is nuisance. And another interesting fact is, as I mentioned, housing themselves in Wandsworth Borough, which Wandsworth Housing is actually one of the biggest providers of housing, there's been a 57% increase over the last year in ASB reporting. So I think it's fair to say that ASB has gone up, and I think it's not just due to a COVID trend, although there are other reasons behind that. Just to put that in context around crime, in crime year to date, crime has dropped 24.6% in inner London. And over the last 12 months, 6.8%. So it's an interesting part where ASB has gone up considerably and overall crime has gone down, and that could be well done to the lockdown. So where have we seen these increases? In the boroughs that I manage, the main increases we've seen, there have been house parties, etc., but that's general. But we have seen significant increases around licensed premises, pubs being allowed to do off-license sales, serving off-license sales, and people then buying those items and either staying around the locality of the public house because they're not allowed to be in due to the numbers, or going into the large parks that we actually have, particularly in Richmond, where they then drinking the alcohol they've purchased and causing further issues. And that has been a significant increase for us to try and manage both manage the pubs and manage the parks. So two different approaches we've had there. First of all is we've tried to work with the licensing team, the regulatory services team, to try and change the way that pubs deal with those issues. And we've also, in two instances, had to issue community protection warnings to the actual landlord of the pub to actually put in conditions that we needed them to adhere to around cleaning up the rubbish, the defecations, and all the other issues that were raised, and putting security on the door that would then go up and down the street and move people on and prevent them drinking outside of other people's houses or actually in people's gardens. With regard to the parks issue, that's been a completely different concept. We've had to work very closely with residents groups, councillors, and all relevant agencies to actually form a partnership problem-solving group to actually look at those issues in more detail. Some real frustration being raised by residents around that, looking to actually try and employ extra services independent of the council of police, which has been an issue for us. But we now have got a real good, clear problem-solving plan. We've got residents involved in that plan. Key residents are involved in that plan. And we share that information out, and I'll talk about the communications in a bit. On the partnership side of things, you have the Safe Neighbourhood Board scrutiny within London, which scrutinise everything with neighbourhoods, and particularly on ASB. You have the Community Safety Partnership Boards, which also scrutinise all crime, which includes ASB. And MOPAC has made ASB a priority across the whole of 32 boroughs of London. Within that, you also have, within our boroughs, we have a community MARIC process, which looks at the highest risk cases. Now, under COVID conditions, this has been quite difficult, because usually you would all meet as partners in a room and discuss the cases that have been brought forward, and you'd problem solve them. But that's not so easy using Microsoft Teams, Zoom, etc. So what we actually have done is we've reduced it so that the problem solving is done outside of the community MARIC process, and you only bring cases into community MARIC now which meet the high risk elements, so they have to fill in a risk assessment and need a partnership unblocking. So it could, whether it's mental health, which is a regular one, or substance use, housing, any of those particular issues. So we know what the issues are, and we can make sure that the representative manager who can actually make some formal decisions is actually part of that process. Our community MARIC's a co-chair between myself and the local borough inspector for the Safe Neighbourhoods team. And that's been really quite interesting as well. The other thing we've been looking at is community trigger. It's obviously a topic that Dame Vera's mentioned and also Andy's mentioned. Community trigger, we've rehashed our community trigger. We have a full process now where people come in. I am the threshold, so to speak. So I get to decide on the threshold, and recommendations are made to me by my community safety manager based on the evidence that's been gathered by the community safety officers and the police officers involved in the case. That threshold in most cases is accepted, and we do a review of the case. When we do the review, I chair the panel, and we have 2 independent members of that panel, depending on what the case is. So it could be someone from housing, someone from mental health, and also, in addition to that, we also have a representative from the local police. But there's a different police officer or from inspector and above, and they're not from the area where the complaint is coming from. And we invite the victim, and in every case it just happened, to actually come and present their case to us in the first instance. So they get to have the voice first. And we make it very clear what the panel's about, and then they receive information back. So that's been quite successful. We've actually had 5 applications of that recently. The other things we've had to do, and many of you out there will be thinking about this, is refreshing the PSPOs, the Public Space Protection Orders. They're up for refresh coming through now due to the times when they were first introduced, and we're in the process of refreshing ours and doing the consultation processes around that and working to try and streamline that process. And I'll be happy to discuss that separately to anybody if they wish some advice around that, particularly around enforcement planning, which seems to be one of the main issues with public space protection orders, is actually showing what enforcement has actually occurred, but they can be very successful. I'm not going to go to communication now. Communication has been paramount throughout the COVID situation. So we were very fortunate. We bought a system called OWL prior to COVID, and we introduced it. And the idea of OWL is it's a digital platform that supports neighborhood watch networks. And it was enabled us to communicate with people out in their communities through their computers and their smartphones. And to pass out crime prevention advice, particularly around fraud, which saw a massive increase at the beginning of COVID, and warning systems around scams, etc. And that was very beneficial. And we're now working with the local police teams to actually generate a shared level agreement so that we can actually send out appropriate messages where they carry out investigation processes and let people know about that in a localized format. And we will provide prevention advice, etc., based on local trends with local communities. And that's been very helpful. One of the key things we did look at is ward panels. Now, this is generally managed by the police. It's a good place to find out about local issues. However, when COVID came in, the police are extremely busy dealing with the COVID situation and their own absence rate, which went up to around 20% at one point. And so we stepped in to help, and we used the various methods from OWL chat room through to Microsoft Teams, Zoom, etc. And we've created, we've been as flexible as we can to ensure these each ward panel has what they feel is appropriate to them, and these have been extremely successful, and attendance has actually gone up, which is a big benefit. And then I'm going to go to tools. So I mentioned the use of community protection warnings. These have been more paramount now. Injunctions, a lot of complaints I've received that injunctions have been given but not been enforced, particularly with committal reasons. And many people might be aware that actually the prisons are all in lockdown to the COVID situation. So committal is very hard to get at the moment, and it's one of those considerations. So if you are going for an injunction, you must look at other options other than just committal if you can at the moment. The other thing that's been brought to my attention is around evictions. Obviously, there was a stay put on the evictions, and that was lifted, and it's back to normal service from the 21st of September. There is some further details around that, but basically anything to do with antisocial behaviour has been brought back onto the table. So your 14 notices, section 14 notices are immediate still, and your section 7A ones are actually back in. I think it's now a 2-month warning system, and I can give further details on that if people need that as well. So evictions, particularly from ourselves who use evictions quite often around residents that cause major issues to local communities. But one of the benefits or silver linings behind this is to look at closure notices and closure orders, and the technical term of partial closures to deal with ASB and to deal with other associated issues of ASB rather than around cuckooing of individuals. And so we're now working very closely with the local police teams to actually develop a process and housing, or develop a process around use of closure orders where they're probably more effective than actually in most cases than the injunctions that previously have been gathered. And that in a nutshell is the majority of what I wanted to say. I'm answering as many questions as I can as going along, but basically we are working as hard as we can across the full remit. We realise that in this digital age, people are constantly in meetings, and you're not having that general conversation when you go to a meeting to pick up other points. So it has been quite difficult. It is difficult, everyone working from home, but we have now moved into a new world, and we have adapted our processes to take advantage of that. Excuse me, to take advantage of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darryl. And without further ado, let me introduce our next speaker, Keith Hunter, Police and Crime Commissioner for Humberside and the lead of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. Keith.
Hello, good afternoon everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to address your webinar, albeit in rather particular circumstances. Of course, those changed circumstances, i.e. the impact of COVID, have had a much greater impact than simply having to move this kind of conversation online. Apart from the obvious medical and public health challenges that local authorities have been front and centre in dealing with, the impact upon crime and antisocial behaviour has been a less obvious and visible challenge, but a challenge nevertheless. Headline numbers of reports of crime reduced during the lockdown period, as we may expect. If most shops aren't open, shoplifting will obviously reduce. If pubs aren't open, the violence associated with the nighttime economy will reduce. And if people aren't leaving their homes, then burglaries, robberies and thefts are going to reduce. For PCCs, as the Commissioners of Services for Victims, however, this wasn't a time to sit back and take a breather. Any change in how we live creates new opportunities and threats for law enforcement as the nature of vulnerability changes. So as some criminal opportunities decrease, the opportunities for more instances of domestic abuse increase, as they do for online exploitation of children for both sexual and criminal ends, and the potential for an increased level of online or telephone fraud presents itself. So PCCs have had to be alert to these changes and ensure that services for the vulnerable and victims were able to flex and offer a service that was responsive to the changed circumstances. I think we've had some success in that, but that doesn't mean that victim numbers haven't risen in these areas, which are some of the most impactful and harmful crimes. And alongside of this was a significant increase in the number of reports of antisocial behaviour during this period. The complication, as we've heard, being that reports of COVID-related breaches in the rules or laws were mostly categorised as ASB. We may think that failing to comply with rules designed to keep us all safe is pretty antisocial, but such behaviour tends not to have the corrosive effect that other forms of ASB can have on the quality of life of individuals and communities. And we're still trying to an extent to unpick the reports received during this actual lockdown period and understand what ASB really looked like during that period and what was driving the non-COVID related reports, so it can assist us if we return to that state of living. Common sense dictates that neighbour disputes, noise nuisance, fly tipping were major contributors, given the fact that rubbish tips were closed, and people were contained in their houses and flats, were able to annoy one another more than usual. So perhaps one issue to consider as we progress through this pandemic would be that during a period of enhanced restrictions, the number of ASB-related incidents that fall specifically within the remit of local authorities are likely to increase at the same time as public health-related pressures will be increasing. What was noticeable was how reports of non-COVID-related ASB picked up once lockdown was released. That shouldn't be a huge surprise, as all of those young people who are behind quite a bit of reported ASB were let out onto the streets with a few months of unspent energy and frustration to express. And of course, schools weren't open, giving those young people a longer period in which to create problems if they were so inclined. As we move forward into a more localised and time-limited period of enhanced restrictions in various parts of the country, it's likely that patterns of ASB will change further. We will all need to be on our collective toes to ensure we have a decent response capability and that those who suffer either as individuals or communities receive a service that doesn't leave them feeling unheard and uncared for. We should all realise by now that persistent ASB can have really serious effects on individual victims, but it can be hugely damaging in a number of other respects when not tackled properly. If communities do not feel their concerns are being listened to, their confidence in the agencies that should be dealing with the issues drops. And there's a real risk they withdraw from being a potential partner in any solutions that are required. If this continues, there's a risk of action being taken that bypasses the agencies in whom confidence has been lost, and that takes us down another problematical and potentially dangerous path that eventually leads to vigilantism. Public confidence is hard won and easily lost, so even during periods of unprecedented challenges in other areas of demand, it is vital for service providers in the field of ASB to make reasonable provision. When demand for services is great, the likelihood is there will be more incidences when services can't respond and some reduction in the overall ability of responsible agencies to meet demand. When calls for service aren't answered, their number eventually drops off, not because of a reduction in real demand, but because the demand isn't being met. During these periods, it becomes more important than ever that services don't rely purely on calls for service, or, put another way, purely on data to make decisions about how to use their resources. When it comes to understanding what is happening in our communities, data do not have all the answers. There must be some way of linking into communities to pick up on intelligence that does not get translated into calls for service and associated data. I know we keep hearing right across every agency that data is the answer to everything, and it certainly must be part of the answer, but in ASB and crime, it must be balanced with intelligence that is not necessarily recorded. Now that's a conversation in itself. I think PCCs have a role here in promoting the listening to those community voices and picking up on the intelligence that data analysis won't provide. And of course, many of the problems associated with ASB are intrinsically linked into criminality. The reality being that ASB is just partway down the continuum that leads to street violence, gangs, drugs, ad infinitum. PCCs also have a role in encouraging the partnership working that I hope you all understand is the prerequisite for any solution to the underlying issues. And that brings me to community safety partnerships, which I believe are or should be a fundamental building block in the construct that is required to address ASB and crime. CSBs vary in size and structure throughout the country, but they remain the statutory body with responsibility for crime and ASB in each local authority area. In some areas, they don't do much at all, whereas in others, local authorities see them as effectively being part of the local authority. However, there are some areas where, following years of a lack of focus, they have become a key partnership once again. The question I would ask you is, if you're not playing your key role in CSPs as local authorities, police or whoever, and using them as a key agent of delivering against ASB and crime, why aren't you? PCC should be encouraging this and having some very serious conversations with the responsible agencies if they are not playing their part. Now, this is where things can become a little problematic. The scrutiny of CSPs falls to local authorities currently, although the ongoing review of PCCs may have something to say about that. And I think for local authorities, that is marking your own homework. We've heard a bit about that already from a couple of speakers, especially given the somewhat patchy engagement with CSPs that we see from local authorities and other agencies up and down the country. CSPs should promote cross-agency working that is capable of addressing the underlying issues that generate ASB and crime. And the constituent agencies should have the links into the communities to allow the intelligence to be gathered that will allow a real understanding of what's happening in communities on the ground that may not be reflected in data currently captured. So, moving forward, agencies in each area will have their own lessons to learn about how they responded to COVID in respect of ASB. But I would urge that every area takes the opportunity to look at this as a partnership also, and how you can take that learning forward to fashion a more capable partnership for the future. Because of the statutory responsibilities of police and local authorities as single agencies with regard to crime and ASB, both agencies have a real incentive to drive CSPs as a primary means of addressing those issues. There is an opportunity to use what has occurred to shape a better future. That becomes even more important if we consider that crime and ASB are heading right back up the agenda for this government. They will be looking to create and apply levers to ensure all partners play their part in delivering the reductions they seem intent on delivering. As the economic landscape looks increasingly bleak as a result of COVID, we should remember that deprivation is the biggest indicator of crime and the SB. So, we may be heading into a period of increased upward pressure in terms of numbers of reports, just at a time when the pressure to reduce is also increasing. Happy times ahead, eh? The only certainty is that working in partnership offers a better chance of success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith, and to all of our speakers. I am going to very swiftly move on to questions and discussions. I can see already lots of questions have come through, and I am just looking to all LGA colleagues so that I can find the summary of questions. So thank you for sending over questions to those who have joined us on the webinar today. And just to say, there are well over 200 people on the webinar. So I think that reflects the quality of speakers that we have. So thank you again. The first question that we have is to all our panelists. Is there any advice for local authorities who are responding to antisocial behaviour reports that are associated with young people in particular? And the second question, again, is to all panelists. What are the benefits of early intervention and mediation before using enforcement or antisocial behaviour tools? So I will open that up to our panelists. I'll come to each of you one by one. Feel free to answer both or one. Dame Vera, if I can come to you first.
I think that there's no doubt that the benefits of trying to intervene early and have mediation are likely to be good. It certainly is a step that needs to be taken ahead of time. I didn't fully grasp the question about young people, but let me just say very quickly, because I realise we've only got a short time left and we're all to try to answer. A huge problem for young people is, of course, the complete decimation of youth services that have occurred over the last couple of years. You know, very few youth clubs, very few diversionary activities, and so on. And as I say, I didn't entirely grasp the import of the question, but it does need to be remembered that most antisocial behaviour is not committed by young people. It is committed by those who are over the age of the youth court. And so I didn't want us to get misled into that. But most certainly early intervention and mediation, if possible, is excellent. But my goodness, it does have to be early. Our office has been at times, you know, quite full of complaints about people who have complained and complained and complained about antisocial behaviour, and have then, you know, when a number of things have been attempted and not assisted, whether they have not had any satisfaction, they've then been offered mediation quite far down the line, at which time it is A, unrealistic, and B, to them you can see possibly slightly offensive even, in that they have been trying to pursue a complaint and they have got some attention but not all that they require and no solution, and they are then being pushed back into a position as if there were a sort of equal status between the parties, they having been complaining about for a while. So I think although early intervention and mediation, very important, capable of being an excellent tool, it does need to be early, really early.
Thank you very much. I'm particularly interested in what you said about the demographic of those who are committing antisocial behaviour. Often in my community, I represent a North London borough, we have high numbers of serious youth violence offences, and I always wonder if there is a link between low-level antisocial behaviour and serious or youth violence. So it's interesting to hear you talk about the demographic of those committing antisocial behaviour.
And also, if I could just add very, very quickly, I think that young people's activities, which can amount to being no more than them being themselves, sometimes in perhaps a noisy way, you know, in a playground with bottles of cider on a Friday, but gone by 9:30, that is often regarded as antisocial behaviour. But in my view, that's too low a threshold, and that is why young people get a bad reputation. I mean, all they're doing is grouping together and enjoying themselves, and as long as they're well away from houses, and as long as they stop at 9:30, then I think it's it's not so grave. So I suspect that that's a harsher judgment that adults inflict on young people than they would on their peers.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Andy, can I invite you to comment?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I mean, I endorse everything Dame Vera has said. This is a delivery challenge, isn't it? In early intervention, it has to be the right thing to do, but how do you do it is the key question. One of the things we've been looking at in my county, and I'm sure it's happening elsewhere, that seems to be showing really positive signs. Well, two strands. The early intervention has brought our local voluntary services together to do that community outreach work that we know has been significantly reduced over the last 10 years. And we did a piece of research to work out which communities are most at risk of antisocial behaviour, and all the factors that lead to crime and serious violence. So we've got 11 priority wards where we focused our voluntary and outreach services. So we get a targeted approach around the community and the individuals and families at risk in those communities. The other piece that I would offer that I think is potentially good practice is for all our outcomes involving young people and all children, all children, and not all antisocial behaviour is children, I know that. But we have a panel, a multi-agency panel, that before police consider charging, which may be appropriate, we get a range of views. What's the right outcome? And what we've seen is in a significant number of the cases, we're not leading to a charge or a quick caution, to use old language from the police, but we're putting in some kind of support and intervention around that child and that family as a result of those partnership conversations. So the community safety panel around people who are repeatedly coming to attention for issues that can lead to more serious issues, I think is something else that's worth looking at as well.
Thank you, Andy. Daryl.
I was on mute. Sorry, can you repeat the question, because I can't.
Yeah, no problem. So no problem at all. So the question one was around the benefits of early intervention and mediation before enforcement and antisocial behaviour tools are utilised. What are the benefits of early intervention? And the second question was whether there is any advice for local authorities responding to antisocial behaviour reports that are associated with young people.
I'm sorry, I come across distorted. I can't hear the questions. If Rachel could type them up, and I'll give you a response, no problem.
No worries. We'll come back in a moment, Daryl. Keith, did you manage to catch the questions?
Did, yeah. I don't disagree with what's been said so far. I think it is a key issue. You've got to get in early intervention early. What I've seen over many years is that there must be, for young people especially, a consequence to their actions, so that there's a learning opportunity for them. Now, that consequence does not need to be anything too heavy-handed. And in one of my local authority areas, they've got what they call a fairway letter, which is a 3-stage ratcheting up of interventions. But the first stage, which is a letter to parents, goes in relatively early. And we find that the proportion of people who come to attention after that very early intervention is vastly reduced, and the numbers on the next 2 steps on that 3-step process reduce substantially with each level of intervention. And whilst that might not seem like much of a consequence, it is a visible step into that young person's life, rather than them thinking and believing that there is no consequence to their action. So I think that very early intervention is a key issue there. I think in terms of intervening with young people, we need to see some more innovation. I'd be really interested in seeing what that could look like. I'm really interested in sort of peer panels for young people, where other young people get involved in discussing the kind of behaviour. And I'm trying to discuss that with my some kind of intervention with my local criminal justice board. There are a number of things you can do there, but for local authorities, you've got to have some capability around this. Wishing this away won't happen. You've got to have the capability and capacity to actually get out there and carry out some early interventions through the local authority and ensure that there's some kind of consequence there. And personally, again, I'm very interested in sort of restorative practice interventions as we progress down that line of interventions.
Thanks very much, Keith. And Daryl, did you want to answer the question about local authorities and young people, or the other?
Yes, absolutely. Very happy to do so. Sorry I couldn't hear before. Yeah, for Richmond and Wandsworth very differently, but what we've been doing in the Community Safety Service is we've been working very closely with the Children's Services, because this is quite significant also with regard to violent crime issue that we've had, particularly in London. What we've been working across is making sure that Children's Services, Housing, Community Safety Service, Community Partnership Department and the police are all working together to actually do prevention and engagement across both boroughs. And the idea is prevention is around the normal things we would think about, creating football, hockey, basketball, art, music, all those kind of activities that keep children off the streets, keep them out of trouble, keep them busy. The engagement element is the bit that's very interesting to me, and that's around we identifying certain young people who are causing harm to the community or are highly vulnerable or easy to be exploited. And they're found through what we have as a MARV process. Many people, the MARV process is connected also to the Youth Offending Service, as well as to ourselves, and as well as to the ASB warning system we now adopted in London. And what we do is those individuals are identified and they're put through into mentoring programs with contextual support around the individual, the family, which is actually very key, and the community. So there's a lot of work that goes on. So there's two elements to it. One is the prevention element and the other part is the engagement. And we pool our resources and our funding through the different funding streams that are available through central government, local governments and ourselves to actually fund these issues.
Thanks, Darren. And actually you've touched upon our next question. So I will come to you first if there was anything you wanted to add. But the question 3 was well, a number of our listeners have commented and have highlighted the challenges of tackling antisocial behaviour with stretched resources and a small number of officers dealing with very large patches and significant populations. What steps can councils and their partners take to try and mitigate these challenges? I know, Daryl, you've spoke about kind of across departmental working, but if you wanted to add anything to that before I go over to others.
Yeah, certainly. The easiest way, when resources are minimal, the easiest way to do it is actually pull resources through different agencies. There are a number of ways of doing that. The one is to ensure you have a proper scrutiny process. And for us, it's the Safe Neighbourhood Boards where we talk about the ASB and what interventions are actually carried out across the partnership into that. And it's a very high level board that actually the borough commander and the highest people in the council, the directors, are brought together. That's one element. The other element is the Community Safety Partnership Board. And I would suggest making ASB in particular an agenda item on there, because there are partners across there, statutory partners such as the fire service, the CCGs, across the board that actually have resourcing available to these services, but many times they're not cited on the issues. And then, for example, in the public health model, where people are talking about that, public health has quite it reports to the Health and Wellbeing Board, who are connected to the Community Safety Partnership Board. I know there's a lot of boards, but what it basically means is they all understand what the issue is. They can actually pool resources, and you can have a lot of activity done by public health at the earlier stages in primary school and secondary school that would support the way you deal with ASB. For the acute ASB that's directly in front of you, the only real resource I can give you is actually to do it in a problem-solving format through such things like the community MARIC and problem-solving partnership meetings and those types of activities, because that is the only way you'd be able to do it as a whole.
Thank you. Andy, I wondered if you might want to comment on that. Resources are tight for local authorities as well as for police forces. So any thoughts in terms of how we can best utilise very little resources across the public sector?
working together. In Essex, the community policing teams and the local authority teams, public health teams, mental health teams work out the same office. So the community safety partnership is a room where people work together, and we don't do this perfectly, but share data and agree priorities. And I know it's not just data, you know, Keith was quite right in that, but sharing what we know and understand, and then we can be as discerning as possible about what we do. That's the only logical way to try and deal with, you know, too much work with not enough resource. It's not easy to deliver. It's not easy to deliver, but you absolutely have to do it talking to each other. So it's the community safety partnership, and how effectively that works is the answer.
Thank you, Andy. Keith, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no silver bullet to reduced resources, but there are ways that we can attempt to sort of work around it. Obviously, partnership is key. Unfortunately, when resources are cut, the natural instinct of organisations are to retreat into themselves and focus on their core activity rather than what should be the response, which is to reach out and look for the combined effort you can deliver through partnership. And this is, it might sound off the point a little bit, but it really isn't. It becomes ever more important when there are reduced resources that the planning of delivery actually is focused upon all the more. And agencies have a tendency to dive into activity because that's what they can do. The can-do organisations, that's what they want to do. But the planning around how you work towards agreed outcomes is really important. So this is about having a proper outcome-focused approach to this, and really focus upon the planning that's behind that. Because when resources are tight, the urge is, again, to urge people to work harder and harder. And it isn't about working harder and harder, it's about doing things differently. And unless you get the planning right and agree on the joint outcomes, what will happen is agencies will just work harder at the same things. And it really is about how to do things differently at a time of reduced resources.
Thank you, Keith. And Dame Vera.
I mean, local authorities are immensely cash strapped. They've had draconian cuts over the past few years, and there's no real sign of restoration. And the police similarly had cuts. There now appears to be some refunding in terms of recruitment, but I don't know that they have loose money all the same. It's imperative, as folk have said, really to act together as partners, and it's imperative because otherwise burdens just shift across from one authority to another. So, I mean, it's something that I know from personal experience of a victim, is that there used to be, if there were noisy neighbours, you know, you would get installed a noise abatement piece of equipment by the local authority, and they would come out of hours if necessary. But when the cuts came, that simply didn't happen. So complaints about noisy neighbours out of hours went to the police, and the police actually don't have a lot of power to deal with noisy neighbours unless it gets to some very high level. So in that way, it's very important for everybody to focus in together, I think. Also, a very key thing that I've found in a number of places is the recruitment of volunteers to support people who are suffering from antisocial behaviour. So various housing departments that I know have been the source of that recruitment. And what they've tried to do is to recruit people who've gone through antisocial behaviour themselves, who have, with the help of the local authority, come out the other side, who can give some personal support, some personal advantage, some personal explanation, some shared experience to the people who are currently suffering. And so this is not, you know, an attempt to do anything on the cheap that should be being done by a professional, but it is a relatively inexpensive way of perhaps giving people moral support. We all having accepted that antisocial behaviour is very debilitating and very harmful. So yeah, partnership is the name of the game.
Thank you very much. And before I just go on to the final question, which I think is a really important one, so I will take it. If I could just add, you know, certainly from a council perspective and speaking to residents on a regular basis around antisocial behaviour issues, it's quite clear that some of the pathways and protocols that are not in place, or some are in place, are incredibly important, not just because it allows us to be smarter with resources in a climate of continuous cuts, but also for the residents who might be experiencing antisocial behaviour. One of their frustrations regularly from residents that I hear is, well, we contact the police, we contact the council, we contact different departments. I feel like I'm going round and round in circles. So a clarity around a pathway or a process allows for us to be able to assist them as well. So I think certainly from a council perspective, I think joint working is incredibly important to be able to make progress. The final question we have is, what does the panel think about mental health and care in the community, given that the county court system can sometimes make it difficult for people with serious mental health difficulties to navigate the system? Dame Vera, can I come to you first?
Well, I haven't got a great deal of experience from which to draw. What I can just feature from the phone calls that I've indicated I have every couple of weeks with victim support services, where they are getting now a lot more calls about antisocial behaviour. They seem to be getting also more calls about antisocial behaviour that has a sense that there is an underlying mental health issue involved in it. I mean, so in two ways. Firstly, they are getting calls which are much longer and where the complainant wants to talk about broader welfare issues and the impact it's having on them. But also some of the behaviour that's related to them seems to be sort of repeat, thematic, you know, not to make a lot of sense and not to be in a way antagonistic to the neighbour, but to be some sort of strange self-expression that is very noisy or very impactive on individuals. So I am thinking that there is, you know, and maybe it's part of what you opened by talking about, which is, you know, the extra stress around people during lockdown, semi-lockdown, limitations on what they can do, leading to things just becoming more serious, more quickly.
Thank you. Keith, any comments on that question?
Brief comments. What do I think about care in the community? I think it would be a good idea. I think just putting people that need care in the community without actually providing the care isn't an answer, and unfortunately that is a situation that we've been in for a long period. The police, local authorities have been picking up the pieces around that. I think there is more of a realisation around that. I think the police service has been pushing that argument for some time. It has been listened to a degree. I think mental health providers have been given additional resources within the past 18 months or so. I think the result of the investment of that resource is starting to feed through to a degree, and I think mental health services are taking a step forward, but it's not quick, and it's not being grasped as something that they necessarily want to do right across the country. I think without some intervention at governmental level, this will remain an area that we make really slow progress in. And I think the government's cross-ministerial, higher level criminal justice group that they've set up under the chair of the Prime Minister needs to grasp this issue, because unfortunately the people that require mental health support form far too big a cohort within the criminal justice system at the moment. I think earlier interventions will prevent that, ease problems throughout the criminal justice service, and ease issues for those agencies that have to intervene when the mental health services aren't there. So there needs to be a movement of resource and commitment from the mental health providers to actually step into that space.
Thank you, Keith. And Daryl, I wondered if you wanted to reflect on that as well, particularly because I know adult social care often have to pick up issues around mental health after police agencies intervene in the first instance.
Yeah, it's a really useful question, and it's not something that is unusual. And all the boroughs I've worked in have had the same issues, and many people I've spoken to. Where we are, we actually are very fortunate. We have what's called the Serenity Integrated Mentoring Model, SIM for short, where police officers are specifically trained around mental health, and that's very helpful, and that reports into our community merit process. We also have the service managers for the mental health trusts work who also sit on our community merit process. So that's really helpful. In addition to that, again, I go back to the community safety partnership and the use of CCG there and the NHS Trust. It's very helpful for them to be made aware of many of the cases that we have, that mental health issues. So they're aware that they need to keep the resources in place to actually ensure support around that. Because mental health is a real issue, but it's something that we have been able to bring in people who make decisions around that. And one recent case, we had an individual who was actually in prison. We were able to work with the prison service in order to ensure that the mental health assessment was made, and then liaise directly with adult social care, who, as you quite rightly say, under the Care Act, etc., pick up these issues and ensure that that person had the right support for when they come out of prison to ensure they didn't cause further ASB. The other issue we've also had with mental health, which is not just relating to mental health, but is an issue, is cross-border or cross-boundary services. So where you have an individual who lives in one borough and also lives in the second borough, and they're under two mental health trusts, receiving two different types of treatment, and both trusts don't have the full information. So we've actually started looking at how we can develop a process to work with partners, not just within our own boroughs, but also across the boundary.
Thank you very much. And Andy, final comments from you.
About 20% of what policing does, there was a big survey last year or the year before, has a clear link to mental health. A number of forces are trialling, different ways of deploying frontline officers with mental health practitioners. So you triage and get that immediate help and support. A number of forces have got mental health managers in their control rooms. So they've got access to mental health databases and records and can give kind of that immediate advice to individuals who may be in mental health crisis. And as Keith said, there's a significant amount of investment that we need to see land in local mental health partnerships that's enabling them to put a significant amount of investment into immediate online support for people in crisis through, I think it's 111 and an option. So there's that kind of access to help, but partnership, resourcing, and understanding that mental health is a massive driver of issues from ASB to youth vulnerabilities to domestic abuse is absolutely the right space for us to be, but just another ongoing one for us to keep working at.
Thank you very much. And I have done a terrible job in timing the session, but I think everyone who's joined will agree, incredibly worthwhile. So thank you very much to panel members. We are very grateful for your time. And without further ado, I will wrap up and remind everybody that I believe this session will be made available online. And if there are any follow-up questions, please do get in touch with the LJ team. We're very happy to filter those follow-up questions to our panel members. Thank you very much.
Thank you.